Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the 28th meeting of the committee in 2013. Can I ask everyone to ensure they've switched off mobile phones and other electronic devices, please? If we could move on to the first item on the agenda, that's an oral evidence session on the implications of procurement reform for public services and community regeneration. Before we start, I should explain that throughout our recent inquiries into public service reform and regeneration, a number of areas related to procurement have been raised. So as a committee, we have agreed to take evidence on these issues in relation to the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill. We will be reporting our findings in due course to the ICI Committee as the lead committee scrutinising this bill. Can I welcome our panel today? We have Andy Milne, the Chief Executive of SURF, Francis Stuart, the Research and Policy Advisor for Oxfam Scotland, and Annie Gunnar-Logan, the Director of CCPS. Can I ask if any of you have got any opening statements? Ms Logan.
Yes, thank you. I'll say one or two things very quickly. Convener, I've kind of come to this session at fairly short notice, so I haven't submitted anything in writing, so I thought I'd better kind of explain myself and why I was here. What I'm happy to do is submit something in writing after this session with your permission. The committee will, I'm sure, be aware that there are three main areas, three biggest areas of public procurement spend in Scotland: construction, IT, and social care. And social care is kind of my bit of that, if you like. My organisation's membership comprises the most substantial social care providers in the third sector, and we estimate that between them, they account for about 750 to 800 million pounds of public money, delivering public services in social care. If you add on to that third sector organisations that are not in our membership and the private sector, then you're actually looking at pretty much 2/3 of total social care spend in Scotland being outsourced and subject to procurement exercises of various kinds, which is about 2/3 of the whole spend. The key issue for us, I think, is that we're dealing with different and potentially conflicting policy imperatives. The policy imperative for social care being around personalisation, self-directed support, empowerment, choice and control for individuals, and so on. Whereas the policy imperative for public procurement is about seeing social care essentially as contract opportunities to be competed and advertised. And the delivery vehicles determined not by the choice of individuals, but by the outcome of public procurement exercises. And interestingly, it was a predecessor committee of this committee that was the first committee of Parliament to look in depth at this area in 2009. It looked at the issue of electronic auctions for social care, whereby providers were asked to kind of bid online down, like a kind of reverse eBay, if you like, for home care for older people. And it was the recommendations of this committee, or the predecessor to this committee, looking at local government issues, that led to the production of very clear guidance for the procurement of social care. And I guess our concern is the extent to which that guidance is being adhered to and observed, and what this bill can do to try and raise the profile of that guidance and make sure that it's implemented more successfully.
Okay. Does anyone... Mr Stuart.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks for the opportunity to come along today. I should probably start by mentioning that Oxfam Scotland are a member of a range of different civil society organisations that have come together and have produced a document setting out our 10 priorities for the Procurement Reform Bill. So that's a range of organisations, including Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, Scottish Trade Union Congress, Scottish Living Wage Campaign. I don't know if you've seen that document, but I'm sure you will in the near future if you haven't already. Perhaps of more relevance to this committee is our work in Scotland. And Oxfam Scotland have had a domestic poverty programme since 1996, so we work with a range of community groups in Scotland on the ground to support them to tackle poverty in their area. I guess our interest in the procurement bill is twofold. One, it's about how do we ensure that public services and procurement processes within that really work better and for the benefit of the poorest people in our communities. And secondly, it's about how do we ensure the economy works better for those same people, and how do we put in place, how do we use the public procurement leverage to put in place conditions that could stimulate that change.
Mr. Milne.
Well, not to be left out, I'll just make a brief statement. Andy Milne from SURF, and you may know that SURF is an organisation that brings together all the different sectors involved in regeneration. And I'm really pleased that the committee is looking at the issue of procurement here. I had the opportunity, which I was grateful for, to contribute to an earlier discussion on community empowerment and a review of regeneration. And I think lots of the discussion there from the committee focused on what are, in all honesty, quite small resources devoted towards community empowerment through the People and Communities Fund and even the £50 million Jessica Fund. And SURF has fairly consistently said that the £9,000 million procurement budget is where the real business is in terms of regeneration. So I want to commend the committee for making the link between regeneration and procurement here. And what I would like to perhaps get the opportunity to discuss a little bit further is the links from this bill across to the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill, which is being launched today, to the aspirations of the Christie Commission, and the important work that's going on in developing an action plan on the back of the Town Centre Review, because I think those things are fundamentally connected, and if we could make those connections meaningful and substantial, then I think there's a real opportunity for progress for regeneration in Scotland.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I could go back to some of the comments that Ms Logan made about those conflicts that sometimes exist between the person-centred approach in social work and the requirement for base value in terms of procurement. Would you say that some local authorities handle these procurements better than others? Have you seen a situation where best practice has been exported, or is it the case that the same old continues?
No, we've been on a journey for some time around this. I think the pressure that local authorities feel themselves to be under stem from the public contracts regulations of 2006. And I don't want to get kind of too anarchy about it, but in essence...
like anarchy.
The legal advice that's given to many local authorities is that in order to comply with those regulations and the EU directives that drove them in the first place, they have to put social care contracts out to tender. Almost regardless of whether there are any performance issues arising. Just because the contract has expired, it therefore needs to be put out to tender. And we found that authorities have handled that in different ways. Some of them have, pretty much started very basic tender exercises where individuals haven't been informed that their care is about to be put back on the market. It's a straight restricted tender process whereby people put in bids. Our issue with that fundamentally is that it's in our view, it's structurally incapable of a paper-based procurement exercise to determine service quality or assess it or a provider's capacity to deliver it. So in kind of 2008, 2009, we saw kind of mayhem really in the social care market as large value contracts, large numbers of staff and large numbers of service users were transferred between providers with all of the kind of managerial difficulties that come along with that around TUPE and so on. Now, when we highlighted that was going on, there were a number of local authorities who took a different approach, started to introduce framework agreements, which they can also do within the regulations. The advantage of a framework agreement is that you don't destabilise the market in quite the same way. So that was kind of a positive change on the part of many local authorities. What we are now discovering is some of the unintended consequences of framework agreements. If you look at what a framework agreement is, in effect, it's one very large 0 hours contract. And that has kind of driven some of the behaviours in provider organisations that I think have quite justifiably received criticism in kind of transferring that model to their own way of working and to their own staff. We've also found that framework agreements have turned into a bit of an exercise in driving price down with no negotiation through capping, for example. You know, you can bid for a place on this framework agreement, but we won't accept any bids that are above X hourly rate, for example, and there's no negotiation about that. Other authorities altogether have taken advantage of some of the scope that was provided in the guidance that I referred to, the 2010 guidance, in effect not to tender at all. Because what the guidance says is that if you can make a case, if you can make a strong business case for retaining for a particular provider retaining the business on the basis that you have applied tests of best value, that the service users are happy with it, that it's a reasonable price, that the quality is coming out reasonably well, you can actually then extend that and roll that contract forward instead of putting it back out on the market. So we've seen all of these practices in different parts of Scotland, and I think what we have an opportunity to do in this bill is to tighten some of that up. And I guess our two asks of this bill, one would be that it took social care contracts out of scope of Section 8, which is the requirement to advertise and compete, just because the contract has expired, you know, as a kind of routine thing. I mean, by all means, put social care contracts back out to tender if there are performance issues. Or if service users want a change of provider, or you know, it needs to be driven by performance and choice rather than by routine expiry. And the second ask we would have is that where a local authority does decide to advertise and compete a contract of its own volition, not because somebody else is telling it to, then it follows the guidance.
Your experiences, Mr. Milne? Do you think that there's good practice out there already?
Yes, I do. I think there is good practice, and there is practice which is not so good. And I think a lot of this relates back to the government's continuation of the community planning framework and the current review that's going on of community planning. And there are opportunities in there for changing the way in which procurement is done, but I think there are, as Annie has referred to, there are considerable pressures on local authorities, economic pressures, short-term pressures, which tend to drive the decision-making processes into the hands of the finance department and the legal department within local authorities, while other departments are concerned with creating conditions for greater sustainability of disadvantaged communities and more innovation and enterprise in particular areas of concern. So at present, the debate is greatly constrained, and one of the concerns I have, one of the concerns that I do have about the way in which the present bill has been framed is the continuing focus on economic growth and business friendly. Now, economic growth is a good thing, but economic growth is not the end in itself. Economic growth, I would argue, would be a route to achieving sustainable communities in a state of well-being and increasing health and equality. And that's not what we've experienced in a unilateral drive for economic growth in recent decades. So if the bill is concerned with ultimately delivering sustainability across the whole of society by rebalancing some of the current imbalances, then economic growth would not, for me, be the main driver that we should be looking at. Certainly a tool to an end, but not the top headline of the purpose of the bill.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here because we've heard quite a lot in the past about some areas of responsibility going towards finance and legal departments. However, from my own past experiences, you often hear of legal departments in particular being blamed for procurement issues when they have given advice, and it's been up to the actual council department itself to decide what to do with it. But it's quite easy in some regards to blame legal or finance. Have you come across that?
Not specifically. I accept your general point that there's a range of influences and factors in which authorities arrive at a conclusion. Political factors inevitably come into play there. But in a bill which I think, to be honest, I think this goes wider than the present bill. I think the Scottish Government, the incoming Scottish Government, 2007, reiterated in 2011, set out a purpose for the government, which is about achieving a flourishing Scotland with opportunities for all, but again set economic growth as the driving force which would achieve that end. I'm just not convinced that over the period of experience that we've had for the last 20 years that we'll get to the position of a flourishing Scotland with greater levels of opportunity for all and equality through the single driver of economic growth.
Supplementary from Anne McTaggart.
It's about the community planning partnerships that you mentioned, Mr. Milne. Where do you see the community where do you see them fitting in to these new duties that's been asked of in the procurement bill?
Mr. Milne.
Well, I was involved in the discussion yesterday because there's a review going on of the relationship between the third sector and community planning. And I think there's a legacy of difficulty with community planning, which was originally described as a process for putting the community at the heart of decision making. And that was a mantra which was repeated by many then ministers for communities. That message, that very clear and repeated message, was heard and understood within communities, that communities would be at the heart of decision making processes. Excuse me. In reality, what we've been dealing with over the period of time is a high-level managerial strategic view of public service delivery. Now, that's an important function, and if we could get that important function right, then that would be great. But to try and drive that at that high-level strategic level, while saying that actually what we're going to be doing is engaging with communities at the grassroots level at the same time, sets up a dual purpose, and the main resource and the main driver, it seems to me, is at the high strategic level. Now, that's important. If we're going to, and I've talked to the committee before about methods through which communities might be more engaged, might be consulted, might be empowered, might achieve ownership. My present view is that that's not through the community planning process. However, I do accept that within the community planning process there are opportunities to engage the third sector generally, voluntary organisations more effectively in the procurement process, and there's some moves in the bill towards that end, and that's to be welcomed. I think what gets lost in the argument, though, is that the third sector often presents itself as some kind of coordinated, homogenous group, when in fact it has exactly the same kind of contradictions within it in terms of its representative functions, its service delivery functions. There are quite often very big players in there. I'm talking about international players in there with huge budgets and huge infrastructure playing to secure contracts for themselves, which may or may not be the best value or the most sustainable outcome for communities. So there's a level of complexity in there. And I think what we need to do here is to sort out these services which we think, as Annie has touched on here, are suitable for a business model and to take a business approach to those, and those which, for much wider purposes, much wider social purposes, are important that they are delivered in a way which is better connected to communities and voluntary organisations, more in touch with local circumstances and players, and which is able to build a genuine framework of capability and capacity at the community level. And I don't think we have sorted those two different things out yet. So I'm sorry this is so long, but my final point, my summary to your question, I think, would be then that I think if we can redefine community planning as the high-level strategic management of mainstream public services, and then devote specific related resources to the building of community empowerment, community connections, community ownership, then we might get a bit further forward in terms of the sustainable chain of procurement and delivery.
Logan.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that, because it seems to me that the bill has the potential to bring these two things together. I mean, if you look at community planning partnerships ambitions as expressed through a single outcome agreement, for example, then you're looking at things like, we want to increase levels of well-being in this area. We want to increase economic growth in this area, where you get things like, there's issues like the living wage, which are not unrelated to that, an ambition like that. We want to increase the quality of public services locally. We want to reduce the crime rate, or whatever it is. So these are the ambitions of CPPs. The ambitions of procurement reform up to this point have been how much savings, what's the level of savings, how much spend can we get on contract formally, how much e-procurement can we drive. So these are the kinds of indicators for success in procurement that really don't kind of marry up very well, in my view, with the measures of success for a community planning partnership. So in the bill, you've got Section 9, which introduces the sustainable procurement duty, and I think that's the, you know, if we could get that right, then that would bring these two things together, so that procurement activity was seen to be supporting the ambitions that we have for public services, economic growth and everything else, rather than just a kind of mechanistic way of, you know, tidying up aspects of spend in various ways. So Section 9 is the key to some of this, I think. I mean, what's missing from it at the moment, in my view, is that there isn't any duty in there about assessing the impact on individual people who receive the services that are the subject of the procurement exercise. I mean, there's something in there about looking at how procurement can serve the interests of the well-being of the community and the local area. But I think it needs, certainly for social care, it needs to drill down right into the impact on individuals. So that would be the key part of the bill for me, really, that would address that question.
Mr. Stuart, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. Just on Andy's point about economic growth, I think Oxfam would agree with much of that analysis. From our point of view, we've seen, even before the financial crisis, we saw growth rates of about 2% per year for 30 years, but within that we still saw about a quarter of the Scottish population living in poverty. So the economy wasn't even working for people at the bottom then. We are seeing increasing recognition of in-work poverty as an issue, but we still seem to be prioritising or continuing the same model of economic development that we've done in the past 30 years. So I read a statistic the other day that 80% of jobs created since 2009 that pay less than £7.95. So if that's the model of economic development that government and the private sector is prioritising, then we're not going to address poverty. I think the procurement bill could help in that regard, but there needs to be serious movement on a host of issues. That the living wage, for example, isn't in the procurement bill or mentioned at all, and that's something we'd like to see much more focus on.
Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. Now, some of what's been said is useful introduction to the couple of things I'd like to pursue, and that is in relation to local procurement in particular. And perhaps I'd like to start against a background of what Ms Logan referred to, the 2006 regulations and EU rules, how difficult or easy in practice is it for small providers to get into the system? And perhaps related to that, is there evidence that local government is over-applying rules to the detriment of allowing small people to come in a way that's proportionate to their ability to bid?
Yes, I think there's something in that, certainly. I mean, what we've found, whether you're a large or a small provider, your capacity to enter a market or to win a contract is determined by how well you can write a tender submission, fundamentally. And contracts tend to be awarded to the people who wrote the best tender rather than to the organisations that are best at delivering. And I think, I don't think that's just an issue for local authorities. I think that's just the setup that we've got. And by implication, perhaps the larger organisations would be better placed to have tender teams and so on. I mean, some of the larger private contractors we hear, I mean, not just in social care, but outside, they actually outsource the writing of their tenders to specialists, which kind of leads you down several looking glass routes of where we actually end up with this kind of thing. So yes, I would say that was a fair comment to make. I think that how we get around that, again, I think that social care contracts should be taken out of scope for advertising and competing, and I think we should look at some alternative models. I don't know if Andy, did you already mention public social partnerships? I think that in Andy's submission, yeah, he mentioned public social partnerships. There's one interesting model to follow. But yes, I would say that the way the system is set up, it can definitely exclude smaller providers from the market, no question.
Milne. on this issue, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just on that particular point, are you aware of anything at the moment that would actually prevent smaller companies and organisations actually coming together to then contract out the writing of their tenders to actually try to win work, as compared to, I mean, you just mentioned about the larger organisations contracting out?
Well, I'm not sure that the contracting out of writing tender submissions is something we should be encouraging at all, although it may well be possible. I mean, it depends on the extent to which the procurement exercise itself encourages collaboration or doesn't. I mean, we've seen some that in social care that specifically encourage organisations to form consortia in order to bid. What we haven't seen is many of them winning any business. And what the blockage is to that, I don't know. But no, in theory, there's nothing to prevent it. The question is whether it's a good thing to be doing.
Thank you very much, Convener. I have a lot of sympathy with some of the things that have been said. I used to be a buyer and spent about 200 million a year and occasionally got bids which were over 3,000 pages. So I can absolutely associate with this. Do you think that the bill that's before us enables priority to be given to examination of the quality that can come from the delivery from a particular organisation over the assessment of the paper documents? In other words, it would be all too easy to exclude a bid very early in the process because the first thing you look at is the paper that you've received, when in fact it could well be that the delivery process. And just playing it back to the context of the smaller bidders, and I'm not convinced by consortia, by the way, because if you get consortia of small people who are for the first time trying to work together, there's bound to be imperfections in that, just the very nature of things. So really, just do you think the bill adequately creates that window of opportunity to actually get the bids to the point where the quality of service might be considered, and for procurers, those who procure, to decide that that's the approach they will take? Or is there anything in the bill would inhibit that?
Mr. Stuart, do you want to go first on that one?
I was hoping to come in on Mr. Stevenson's previous point, if that's possible, and probably premise that by saying that Oxfam aren't experts in procurement processes, but one of our partners in Govan, I think a couple of the committee members visited some of our partners in Govan earlier this year. But one of those, an example of sort of some of the imperfections in the system, one of those partners was approached before the tendering process about a contract coming up for £120,000 within the NHS, which was looking at sort of community health and capacity building in communities. They were encouraged to take an interest, which they did. They were then told that they would have to register on Public Contracts Scotland's website. So they looked at that and they had sort of some difficulties at how to do that. They didn't have the skills or expertise to do that. The next stage after that was they were then told that there would be, because of TUPE, they would have to take on 100,000 out of the 120 grand contract. 100,000 would be TUPE. The cross-4 staff would have to come across that they'd have to manage with pension liabilities and so on. So this is a community group that doesn't have, it probably has a few thousand to its name in terms of income. So it was just never a possible goer. So that was, I guess that highlights, and this was probably a statutory body that was trying to do good in terms of encouraging interest, but that wasn't ever a theoretical possibility for that group. So I think we do need to look at alternative mechanisms, and grants for those type of organisations are more suitable. They're used to that process, but also other alternatives in terms of an example that Oxfam was involved in was a participatory budgeting exercise in Govan Hill, where there was £200,000 gifted to community groups to disperse, which they did, and that was by all means and evaluations, that was a very good process that was distributed, and a wide range of community groups got access to that funding and benefited from it.
I just wanted to a tiny wee point that's on the back of that as to whether it would be legal and possible for the organisation that's procuring a service or whatever to actually fund bidders. Would that help small organisations?
Anyone want to have a go at that one?
To fund bidders in order to bid more successfully, in order to...
I may say this is not a novel experience. I've done it myself in the past.
Anyone want to have a go at that?
I think some of it happens already in the sense that local authorities will have programmes of supplier engagement, which may include some element of training and development around how to write bids and submit tenders. Whether you can actually kind of point to one supplier in particular and give them money to do that, to the exclusion of others, I don't know. I think we might be getting into kind of state aid rule difficulties at that point.
Is the panel's reaction such that my suggestion is frighteningly novel?
I'm often frightened by novelty, yes. I do. If I could say, I do think it's an interesting concept, but it makes my mind drift towards what is it we're trying to do here, and what is the point? Is the point that small voluntary organisations can become small businesses and compete in a competitive market more successfully? There might be advantages in that. Might also be some perversions in that in terms of what local community groups actually are, what their values are, what it is they're trying to achieve, particularly when those community organisations are relying on and driving and using voluntary efforts of people, who are doing it because they think this is a good thing for my community. It also makes me feel good, and it adds to the broader well-being. When you try to set that alongside a competitive model, and certainly alongside business partners, then clearly there are going to be difficulties. And that, again, that goes back, and I hope I'm not being too glib here, but when SURF made input under the Consultation with Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill, we urged the government to give some thought to what kind of services do we just need to set down the kind of frameworks for a civilised society which has a reasonable chance of promoting well-being and enhancing equality. What kind of services are essential, and what is the best way of providing those services? And I would submit that we've drifted in the last, certainly, quarter of a century into a conception that almost everything, probation services in England perhaps, can be run by private companies, somehow more successfully, or the process of taking them into that arena of competitive tendering and short-term turnover with an eye to cost savings is the way to go. And I think a government which has a very broad understanding of the importance of the outcomes of well-being and sustainability and community empowerment should be capable of identifying some of the building blocks which deliver that alongside the enterprise and drive that we get from more private sector models.
One of the things which we've found as we've been going around the country visiting various places and inquiries on regeneration and public service reform is a frustration where small organisations in particular who are procuring themselves from public money are having to jump through a huge amount of hoops with some of the local authorities, with regulations which are immensely risk averse. And we're talking very small procurements. If I remember rightly, in a visit to South Ayrshire, one of the things that was talked about was the hassle of trying to get a wheelbarrow when it would have been quite easy to go to get one from B&Q, which would have probably been the cheapest you could possibly get. That risk-averse scenario, does that cause you a huge amount of grief? Yes.
Yes.
And is it the case of some folks, some organisations, strengthening the regulations, their own regulations to such a huge degree, which is really quite unnecessary? Would that be?
Well, I think the principal risk that contracting authorities consider is the risk to themselves of litigation if they don't follow the procurement regulations and a disgruntled provider wants to challenge the contract award. That's the kind of primary risk that is on a lot of the minds of contracting authorities. And you might take the view that is not the key risk that should be in their minds. It's the risk to the ambitions that they have set out with partners in the SOA or anything else. I wanted to come back briefly, if I could, on Mr. Stevenson's point about how you evaluate quality. The social care 2010 guidance is quite good on that. Our issue is that nobody looks at it, or at least if they look at it, it all becomes too daunting, which is why I want to give it a bit more welly in the context of this bill. And as an example of that, I mean, it has been the case once or twice that procurement officers have said in all seriousness that if in your bid you produce some evidence, independent evidence of the quality of your service, which has been independently evaluated by a third party and can kind of demonstrate your credentials, that you can't actually take that into account during a tender exercise because not every bidder can produce something similar, and therefore it breaches the non-discrimination principle. Which seems to me to be utterly bonkers, I have to say. So that's the kind of thing that we need to get round in relation to quality, and fundamentally, whose quality is it anyway in social care? Because what I said earlier on about the imperatives being around user choice. And it's the service user's determination of what will meet their needs and who is to provide their support and what that package of support will look like. Whereas once you start down a procurement exercise, you are bound to award the contract to whoever comes out with the best score at the bottom. You can't do it any other way. And the degree to which the people who are using the services and will benefit from it have any kind of input into that is the really tricky bit. We worked with government to put an amendment into the Public Sector Reform Act, which was the one that tidied up the kind of scrutiny landscape, because at that point we had become aware that many local authorities were not taking into account in any way at all Care Commission gradings for services in their contract award decisions. So here you had, a national body which was set up specifically to assess the quality of social care services, and its deliberations and its judgments and its assessments of quality were not always being taken into account in contract award, which just seemed to us to be absolutely bizarre. So these are the kinds of hurdles that we've had to overcome here, and I think, I go back to Section 9 here, because I think that's where that has the potential to resolve some of these difficulties, if we get it right.
Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Just to go back to the issue, and I think the Convener was right to open up by saying that we're looking at this in relation to community empowerment and how we get community organisations engaged in a process of delivering services at a local level, not a community planning partnership level, because we've had that debate in this committee about how community planning partnerships operate, and the size of some of them totally ignore what's happening at a local level. What can we do, or what can the Scottish Government try and do to ensure that we have communities who genuinely want to engage in the procurement process to deliver care services at a local level? And that may be a village level, it may be in a scheme level. How do we get to the stage where communities can engage in that process and basically, hopefully, be successful in bidding?
Who wants to have a crack at that first? Mr. Milne?
Can I broaden it out a little bit from the care issue, if that's okay? Because I think, Annie makes a great case, in a non-anarchic kind of way on that. So I'll leave that to her. In a broader sense, on community empowerment, community capacity, and the ability of communities to drive futures within their own area, SURF is doing a piece of work at the moment, supported by the Scottish Government, called Alliance for Action. We're doing this on the back of the work that's been done in recent years towards the Community Empowerment Renewal Bill. We're doing it on the back of a piece of work that we did for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, analysing the impact of the recession on disadvantaged communities and how communities are responding. What we're trying to do there is to see what is possible when we connect up national organisations with resources and policies in support of community empowerment with local organisations which have knowledge and experience, active initiatives, and to make that resource connection and then see what happens as a result of that, particularly when we're able to connect up those different factors, physical and care factors and enterprise at a local level. What happens in terms of the change within that community and its ability to determine its own future. Now, we're nearly a year into that process now, and there's some very interesting connections coming out of that, but it's a developmental process of identifying where the resources are, where the assets are. There has been substantial talk and welcome talk, particularly emanating initially from Chief Medical Officer Harry Burns, at looking at asset approaches to regeneration, asset approaches to health. The question that raises is, do we know what those assets are? Do we know where they are? Do we know what their capability is? And I think in the review of community planning, we would be arguing that it should be possible for local authorities as the leads in community planning to undertake a process either themselves or through a third sector interface or other suitable organisation to map out what assets actually exist within areas in a way which would inform and open up the possibilities to develop the kind of connected routes of assets and sustainable procurement routes which elude us at the moment. And that's why I'm enthused by some of the innovations around the public service partnerships which are being developed on the back of some modest investment from the third sector division of the Scottish Government in a way which reaches into communities and understands where the capacities are there, where the experience is there, and through a consultative process builds a model of delivering a particular service, rather than standing back and trying to be legally objective in that risk-averse way and simply putting out a contract for the delivery of a very discrete piece of work, but rather looking beyond that to what it is we're trying to achieve in that community and what the potential is within that community. I'm sorry if that's a little vague and unfocused, but I think it's about the direction of travel, and again it's about what it is we're ultimately trying to achieve here. If it's okay, if I could just bring in one other element alongside this. Okay, I will be brief then. I think in respect of physical regeneration, it's a disappointment to SURF that there's no reference in the Sustainable Procurement Bill to the hubco model of delivering regeneration on a national level. We've talked about this since 2006, since the model was first brought forward under a previous regime. Many of our members indicate that that model of corralling procurement of physical regeneration together into 1 million population centres has sucked expertise and opportunities out of smaller population centres and delivered them to large, often multinational organisations. The fact that that's not in this Sustainability Procurement Bill is a matter of concern. There's a separate paper on public sector procurement around construction, which has been developed in recent months and is now, I understand, with the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure and Cities, Nicola Sturgeon. And I'd welcome a bit of consideration, at least if not at this session, by the committee on the connections between the Sustainability Procurement Bill and this review on construction, because there's a lot in there about local jobs, thriving town centres and local employment.
Thank you. I just wanted to kind of give an example of where I think the difference between a procurement approach and a commissioning approach might be in this respect. If you've identified that there's an issue in an area in relation to older people who are having difficulty preparing meals, right, the kind of stock response to that is Meals on Wheels, preparation of meals for someone, then delivery to them. So a procurement discussion around that becomes, how can you procure frozen meals in bulk, at best cost, through a procurement exercise. What I think a community and commissioning and more kind of Christie Commission type response would be is, well, is the delivery of 7 days worth of frozen meals to a lonely older person struggling at home the best response anyway? And And then you would have a process with older people in the area and their carers about what might be the best response to that. And it might not be the delivery of frozen meals at all. It might be putting money into the third sector to stimulate some lunch club activity or any number of other responses. If there are elements coming out of that are amenable to being specified, pre-specified, then by all means go out and procure them, but it isn't necessarily a procurement discussion right from the outset. And I think what we need to do is enable some designing of services to take place out with the procurement process, and only bring the procurement process in once we've co-designed or co-produced, or whatever particular word you want to use, once that work's already been done. And I think the difficulty that authorities have around that is how they select their partners for that, who can they draw in, and this is where the legal advice keeps coming in about, you know, make sure that people are treated equally and that you don't discriminate against suppliers. And I think that's what's driving this idea that you, within the authority, have to pre-specify everything yourself before you actually go out to the market. So I'd like to see a bit more latitude for authorities in kind of picking who they work with around this, and consulting with communities and service users in order to design whatever it is that you're going to procure, if indeed that's what you're going to do.
Just to kind of expand on the issue about commissioning versus procurement, because it's quite an interesting concept in terms of, rather than saying to local authorities you have to go out and put a tender out for procurement service, what you'll do is commission. What's the difference? Because if we can get that right, then I think there is an opportunity to allow local community organisations who run community cafes to deliver the type of services that you referred to, but without having to go through a tendering process to actually deliver those services if either the health board or the local authority were to commission instead of procure.
And I guess the definition of commissioning has now been set out by the National Steering Group on Joint Strategic Commissioning. I mean, this is all in the context of health and social care integration, so it doesn't kind of cross over into all the areas that the colleagues are interested in. But the commissioning process starts with the analysis of needs in an area, and then looks at the outcomes that you want to achieve in that area, and then starts to design what needs to be put in place around that. Only then do you decide what will be the subject of a procurement exercise, having done all of that work first. And I think that's where some of the legal juries are out on the difference between commissioning and procurement, because within a commissioning strategy, it would seem to me perfectly legitimate to take some decisions to say, well, you know, that we're going to do this in a different way. Here's the stuff that we're actually going to put out to tender on the market, but we're going to set up arrangements for some of these other service responses in entirely different ways. And that's what I'd quite like the procurement bill to nail once and for all. You know, what is the latitude that you have to do things differently rather than go out to the market?
Thank you. One final question, Commissioner. Sure. In terms of the issues around the living wage and how we incorporate the living wage into any procurement legislation going through this Parliament. And we have advice saying that the living wage may be contrary to EU guidance in relation to applying for any commissioning contract that goes out. How do we get, do we have any ideas how we get the living wage into the contracts, or build into the contracts the terms and conditions that allow a situation to, as Mr. Stuart said, see a real economic growth or economic development for individuals who are being taken on by these contracts or job opportunities that may arise out the tendering process.
Mr. Stuart, how do we deal with the eternal question of Beaufort versus Niedersachsen?
My understanding is that there's other legal advice that suggests that it would be possible to include the living wage as an award criteria, even on the face of the bill. There'd also be, if that wasn't possible, there would be a possibility to include it in guidance or as a contract performance clause. So there's a range of organisations which perhaps you might hear from in future, in terms of there's a lot of work being done by STUC and a lot of the trade unions on this, and Poverty Alliance and others who are really expert on that. So our view from their evidence or from their expertise is that that's definitely possible. I wanted to come back to, just on the other point about how we might go beyond the living wage. I think that's a really good point, and perhaps it goes back to what Ms Logan was talking about in terms of the sustainable procurement duty and strategies. And if we do that right, there's an opportunity to really look at the local area. That's what that duty is about. So if we can really nail that, which would have to be done in a really consultative and participative process to get that right. And I think that for us is where part of the bill falls down. In terms of, I think the head of Oxfam Scotland in a previous evidence session to this committee said that the relationship between communities, particularly the poorest communities in local government, is often not a partnership, it's a war. And I don't think the procurement bill is going to change that. But where it does fall down is one, I think, on community engagement, and two, often we see the relationship in the bill is between the contracting authority and an economic operator, and there's not really capacity or space within that for the community or for people and users to be part of that process. And the second, really, for Oxfam is about the extent of socio-economic poverty and inequality in Scotland, and too often there's not really a recognition of what the real barriers faced by people in poverty to accessing public services are, and that it's not simply a level playing field between them and the rest of society, that they have additional constraints and difficulties in terms of accessing public services, and there's increasing academic literature on how middle class advantage in public services is really an issue, even in terms of things as basic as street cleaning or street lighting. So for Oxfam, I think one of the areas we'd like to see a lot more focus is that socio-economic disadvantage. We've proposed in the past a socio-economic duty on all public bodies, and if that could be incorporated into either within that sustainable procurement duty, a much more of a focus on that, or else a separate duty, that would be really helpful for Oxfam. We've also proposed, and I think there's been discussion with this committee in the past, a poverty commissioner to enforce that. So they would have the ability and flexibility to look at to what extent procurement processes are really benefiting the poorest people, and they could hear from those people in terms of how it impacts on them. Okay,
we're getting pretty pushed for time now, so briefer answers and briefer questions, please, folks, if possible. Mr Baker.
I'll try and oblige. Given we've got a focus in the Committee on Regeneration and Sustainability, I do think Mr Stewart's comments regarding living wage are very interesting indeed, and we should look into those. But I've got, my question actually is for Mr Milne in the first instance, because I was also going to ask you about the HOB contracts, because from a regeneration point of view, and you say this is undermined by that approach, we also hear, I'm sure all of us do locally, about the point of view from local businesses employing local people, that they are squeezed out by that process, which is lumping these big contracts together. You say it's not addressed by the bill. How should it be addressed to ensure that those smaller businesses are getting that better chance, and which will provide local jobs?
Well, I think there has to be a fundamental challenge of whether the hub-co model is working in the interest of regeneration at the local level. There's a separate analysis of what the Scottish Future Trust are doing and what the outputs are in terms of overall cost savings at a national level, and some questions about that. I think what the bill could do is to help us look at the some of the detrimental impacts of employing that particular model, which again seems to me to go back to a very short-term view of cash-only savings without a consideration of the loss of local jobs, the loss of local infrastructure, local confidence and connections, the increasing of length of supply lines, which takes us into the territory of carbon use and climate and ecological challenges. So SURF has had a long-term relationship with the Scottish Futures Trust on this by way of debate, and Scottish Futures Trust are adept at making a good case for what they're trying to achieve. But I do think there's been a bit of a blind spot over what is now a considerable period of time about what the impact is at a local level. We are hearing that very clearly from our members at a local level of two issues. One is the issue that you raise, Mr Baker, which is about the general scaling up and the way in which that reduces opportunities at the local level. The one issue which is addressed in this consultation document, which I understand Nicola Sturgeon now has, is about the promptness of payment under the hub model, and that is causing, you know, again, big organisations can hang over and can wait for their money, obviously, for a much longer time. Smaller organisations can easily go to the wall, particularly in the current economic climate, when delays in payments are coming through. And when they're coming through a government model of procurement, I think that's particularly worrying.
I think that's something we should pursue as ministers. In general, I mean, is this something that might be addressed by the thresholds which are set for which the level of contracts of 50,000 and for supply of service contracts or £2 million work contracts? Would that be addressed by reviewing those thresholds? And in general, are those thresholds correct?
Well, in early criticism of the hub model as it emerged around 2006-2007, there was some subsequent adjustment of the thresholds, and I think that's helpful, and I think there's much further to go on that.
Final question, and convener, though, just one remark is that it seems to be quite a lot of push to promote the hub model, which doesn't actually encourage, you know, re-tendering a contract for in construction when it comes to social provision, as Annie Logan mentioned, that there seems to be kind of a risk aversion to that when it comes to the social sector and the third sector to have those kind of framework agreements. But I mean generally, I think what I'm coming to in this, originally this was going to be a sustainable procurement bill. It's not a procurement reform bill. Are you confident that issues of sustainability remain at the heart of the bill and will be improved through its, if the bill's passed in its current form?
Ms Logan?
Well, I suppose what the thing is called isn't as important as what's in it, and Section 9 is, the risk of repeating myself, is the key to that. I do think this links up with the living wage issue. If I can just come back on Mr Wilson's question about that, because if your purpose is sustainable economic growth through procurement, you know, you're not going to achieve that if you impoverish your contracted workforce. I mean, and so the legal advice may well be that you cannot address this in the award criteria for contracts, but, you know, then why not start addressing it in the selection criteria for contracts? I mean, you've got Section 24, which I think has got enormous potential in relation to this. It's kind of got little stars and squiggles all over it in my copy of the bill, because I think that's where we go for that. I think the biggest challenge isn't in getting the legal issues right around this, it's finding the money, because certainly in home care, you've got a very substantial proportion of the workforce now who are below the living wage. So, you know, the challenge for authorities isn't, frankly, going to be about whether the legal niceties can be tied up. It's going to be finding the extra £500,000 or whatever it is that they will need in order to pay their contractors to pay the living wage.
You're very helpful.
Okay. Before we move off of community benefit and the size of contracts, Section 20 of the bill, it's the proposed bill, it talks about community benefit, where the procurement is in relation to estimated value of the contract equal to or greater than £4 million. What's your views on that? Mr. Stuart?
Yep. I think our view of that is that at the moment it's I think it's an enabling, or it's not an enabling power. It's an option for economic operators, and we'd like to see that a requirement. I think the other important point for Oxfam is to look at. I think it's right that training and skills and opportunities are there as part of a community benefit requirement, but it needs to be more than that, and you need to actually go out and ask the community what is the benefit that they really want. Oxfam did quite a large participative process 2 years ago now, where we developed the Human Kind Index, and we went out and spoke to about 3,000 people across Scotland, and we asked them what they need to live well in their communities, and it was quite a big process, but it wasn't particularly difficult in terms of we went out to where people were, we did street stalls, we did focus groups, and I think all you need to do is you have to go where they are and you have to resource that, and that resourcing that means you might have to you might have to pay for people to come along or provide childcare and all the range of factors around that you need to involve people in that process. And I think that is for us, both in that section but also out in the other parts of the bill, is a bit of a gap in terms of how you actually resource community engagement, particularly for the poorest communities.
Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's on to the hubcos again. But earlier on, I posed a question to Ms Logan regarding are there any impediments to smaller organisations kind of basically getting together. And she said also she wasn't aware of any. Obviously, and that was regarding the focus towards community kind of health care. Now, but that particular question can cross kind of any range of operations, and one of which being construction. So, in terms of the hubcos, obviously, local authorities across Scotland are building new schools, some of which also the agreements are kind of cross local authority boundaries to make some of these savings. If the hubco operation wasn't there, how many kind of smaller organisations do you think would actually be taking part in actually building some of these new schools? And what difficulties or issues would local authorities actually face and actually get, would they face to really get these smaller companies to kind of get together and kind of put forward proposals and then kind of carry out the work?
Mr Milne.
Yes, I mean, it's clearly a challenge, and the hubco model comes out of a much broader direction of travel, which is towards larger multinational organisations delivering services, not just on very large scale, but right down into local level through homogenised models. I'm suggesting, certainly in terms of community empowerment, that those models are likely to miss the opportunity to connect to local resources and local talents, local skills and particular trades which have been built up. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if local authorities and others are going to be able to deliver large projects, then they're going to need to be able to rely on supply chains that are going to be able to deliver at the right cost, in the right time frame and to the specification required. However, my concern with the hubco model is that it seems to be driven solely on the basis of achieving economies of scale and evening out supply lines with a view to saving money over the shorter term. There's a lack of consideration in the concept of hubco or around it in terms of what the impact of that short-term saving is to the longer-term sustainability of local companies, local jobs, short supply lines, vibrant high streets, successful town centres. And it's for the Scottish Government to take a broad view of the balance of priorities that it puts against achieving shorter-term savings through economies of scale, against what it states in the purpose of government, what it states in the draft of this bill, that a consideration of well-being and addressing inequalities is in the mix. So it's about degrees. The degree to which our focus is on economic growth as a singular model, or balancing our investments towards supporting broader outcomes on well-being. Now, in the hubco has, my view is that hubco has been a very powerful model and has been driven through successfully in achieving the aims largely which it's set for itself, at least in terms of its structure, if not in terms of its outcomes. The result of that has been a change in the local environment in terms of where the capacities are and where the companies are. And I think this bill is an opportunity to pause and reflect on that direction of travel and see what other alternatives are, what other alternative methods of procurement might be in physical construction with a view to sustaining local suppliers. I don't have, I suppose my final comment would be that all of our efforts are contextualised within much larger, wider forces, which we have to take account of. What we're looking for here are the opportunities for doing things better in a more imaginative way.
Mr McMillan.
Thank you, and certainly for that response. I mean, I do have a tremendous amount of sympathy for much of what you've actually had to say, but when it comes down to actually the building of the schools, I do question the issue of how many smaller companies within the areas that we represent could actually go ahead and build some of these schools. Now, I've spoken to many small and medium-sized companies about this particular issue, and it's a point that they've actually raised with me as well. But also, maybe we could continue that discussion some other time. Something else you actually raised in your submission, it was regarding under the tactical approach is ineffective. And in that particular paragraph, you highlighted the current Scottish Government-led experiments in fostering public social partnerships are beginning to show how more cooperative processes can meet preventative Christie Commission strategies. Can you provide some examples of that, please?
Well, I think there's current discussions going on involving Turning Point organisation and others in terms of providing services for people coming out of prison, people with who may or may not have severe issues around drug misuse, alcohol misuse, etc. And the process which is being put in train there is to look at not just, for instance, the issue of housing, but when somebody comes out of prison, do they have a house, but do they then have opportunities to connect with other services in a way which enables them to sustain that house, to sustain a lifestyle which will bring them closer to the possibility of entering into employment, whatever opportunities are there. And through that process, to connect them up with local voluntary organisations providing support services, opportunities, skills development, etc. It seems to me that more consultative, collaborative approach is more likely to end up meeting the needs of that individual, the varied needs of individuals as they emerge, than a single approach which is focused solely on the housing issue, or solely on the employment issue, or solely on the skills issue. So again, it goes back to my earlier point about knowing where the local assets and support mechanisms are and how they might be connected to meet the needs of individuals in a more flexible way rather than a single packaged contract for one aspect of service delivery, which is what the model that we largely have at the moment.
Yeah, just on the back of that, I think the crucial thing about the public social partnership model is that its primary expectation is that the different organisations involved will collaborate with each other rather than compete with each other. And that brings to bear all of their different skills around the particular needs, of whatever it is. It's in our case, social care, but the really kind of big activity in PSPs at the moment has been focused around the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund, where in phase 2 of that, all of that money was accessible to the third sector on condition that they would collaborate in relation to public social partnerships. It wasn't a pre-specified contract which was put out to the market and people competed on it. What may happen is that some of the models that they have designed may well be the subjects of procurement exercises further down the road, but the point is everybody's had their chance to co-design it. And that's where it differs very significantly from the kind of bog standard competitive tendering that we've seen, if you like.
And through that method, we've understood better where the other opportunities are, whereas through the conventional procurement method, everybody shuts down and hides their books and hides their working in a way which precludes the possibility of understanding what other possibilities are there.
And you've got very large organisations and very small organisations collaborating in the same partnership to meet the needs that have been identified for individuals there. So it's kind of quite it's not perfect. The rules change from one PSP to the next, and we're kind of moving our way towards understanding its potential, but certainly there's more enthusiasm about it than just kind of bunging stuff out on the market. And
Cameron Buchanan, please.
Just had one sort of question about on the difference between commissioning and procurement. Do you give any feedback to the people who have not, to the companies who have not been successful? Is there any feedback? Is there any reason why they felt it's not presumably just on price, it's presumably on the way they present it? Is there any feedback so they can try again next time?
Feedback.
Well, we're the contracted rather than the contracted.
You get feedback from local authorities?
Do you get feedback from the authorities, have you?
Yes and no. I think another really good thing in the bill is how it's going to tighten some of that up and specify what feedback about what and under what circumstances, because it's not that open. And in our submission to the consultation around this bill, we highlighted the fact that some disgruntled contractors are now starting to issue freedom of information requests to authorities in order to find out exactly what it was about this winning bid that was so great in relation to their own.
Yeah. Actually, this is the freedom of information.
And I think that leads to all kinds of complications around commercial sensitivity and redaction and all the rest of it. So what's in the bill around that, I think, is really, really positive.
Mr. Milne? Mr. Stuart, no. Stuart Stevenson, you had something on that.
I just wanted to ask for a little point that do you think it would be proper that it is a requirement that bidders are told of any matters in their bid, the omission of which or the presentation of which excluded them without regard to what any other bids may say? In other words, it's not that they were beaten by another bid, but that there were matters either omitted or included in their bid that prevented their being a successful bidder. Given that that's not a competitive issue, do you think it would be appropriate that this legislation takes the opportunity to embed that particular point in relation to feedback?
A lot of these matters are normally picked up in pre-qualification, yeah. Any comments on that?
Sounds entirely reasonable.
I think clearly it would be desirable, that better understanding, and that's an opportunity to send messages and to encourage in particular areas. I'm guessing, this is beyond my specific area of knowledge, but I'm guessing that there might be some concerns again about comeback on that and challenge on that in terms of the fairness of the process.
Some of the feedback that social care providers have had has kind of served to highlight some of the absurdities of the process, such as, well, that information really ought to have been contained in your answer to question 2, because then we could have given a score to it, but because you put it in question 5, we couldn't. That kind of thing. So it may help to expose some of that.
Can I thank you very much for your evidence today? I suspend for a couple of minutes to allow you to vacate your seats. Thank you. During the course of our public service reform inquiry, particularly Strand 3, we have gone over that in some depth, and obviously we are keen to continue to try and harness the talent of public sector staff, and that will be a focus of ours in everything that we do. What I would propose to members is that we close this inquiry. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. I now suspend and we move into private session.